When the world slept, an outsider stepped into a forgotten Stanford lab at 2 a.m. and began rewriting the laws of science. The automatic doors sighed open with a sound like a final exhale, and the boy stepped into the silence. The corridor behind him stretched into darkness, polished linoleum reflecting the faint glow of emergency lights. Somewhere far away, a motion sensor clicked, then went quiet again. He was not supposed to be here. He never was. But he had learned the rhythm of the campus, the way the guards rotated shifts, the precise moment when doors unlocked for nightly system resets. Inside the lab, white light hummed overhead with the cold indifference of a hospital ward. Machines slumbered, a rack of servers blinking in slow, sleepy rhythms, robotic arms frozen mid-gesture, a spectrometer with its screen dark. It was the heart of one of Stanford's most advanced research facilities, yet at this hour it resembled a mausoleum of unfinished dreams. He dropped his worn backpack onto the nearest chair. Its fabric was frayed, a patch stitched by his father years ago still holding the seams together. From inside he pulled a battered notebook, its pages dense with scribbles, diagrams, and equations, collected like fragments of treasure scavenged from discarded lecture notes, old journals, and glimpses of chalkboards he had cleaned late at night. His father was a maintenance worker at the university. His son, though never enrolled, had quietly become a student of everything. The boy's shoes squeaked as he crossed to the glass board at the center of the room. Under the fluorescent glare, ghostly remnants of an unfinished equation stretched across the surface. The Navier-Stokes equations, half smeared, half abandoned. Fluid dynamics, the puzzle that had haunted mathematicians for centuries. The turbulence problem no supercomputer had yet tamed. Professors had wrestled with it here. Teams of graduate students had taken their shots, but the lines always ended in hesitation, a pause, a wipe of the marker, and silence. His breath fogged the glass faintly. He set down his notebook, opened it, and picked up a marker. The cap popped off with a sound that startled him in the emptiness, echoing louder than expected. For a moment, he froze. Then he began to write. Time was his enemy. On the wall near the exit, a digital clock flickered, 01:59:34. In less than 30 minutes, the building's automated system would engage. Doors would lock, lights would dim, security would sweep. He had only ever stayed inside once when the lockdown came, and the memory of pounding on the sealed door until a guard dragged him out was burned into his chest. Tonight, he had no intention of being caught. Yet urgency sharpened him. His strokes on the board grew quicker, surer. Each symbol flowed from the next, born not of textbook memorization, but of necessity, an improvisational dance of logic and memory. He remembered the first time he saw the Navier-Stokes equations in a discarded printout, lines of Greek letters like a language from another world. He had spent weeks unraveling them, not because anyone told him to, but because the symbols had whispered a challenge. Now, at 2 a.m, the whisper had become a demand. He was 15 years old, though the gauntness of his frame made him seem younger. His father called him Daniel, but inside this lab, in the company of numbers, he felt like something else. Not a boy, not yet a man, but a vessel for the logic of the universe. He did not think of himself as solving. He thought of himself as listening. Each step of the derivation was like placing his ear against the chest of nature itself, waiting for the heartbeat to emerge. He paused, marker hovering as memory intruded. His father's hands, calloused, raw from cleaning solvents, had once lifted him onto a stool so he could wipe chalk dust from a blackboard. "Every mark tells a story," his father had said. "Even when it's erased, the board remembers." That was years ago, but tonight Daniel was writing his own marks into the silence, daring the board to remember him. The hum of servers filled the room like distant thunder. A cooling fan whirred louder for a moment, then settled. The lab smelled faintly of ozone and rubbing alcohol, a sterile scent that belonged to machines, not people. Daniel leaned closer to the board, his eyes flicking between the half-erased equations and the wild forest of notes in his notebook. The problem was turbulence, the unpredictable behavior of fluids that defied linearity, that laughed at approximation. Engineers dreamed of taming it for aviation, for fusion reactors, for climate models. Governments poured billions into simulations that still broke down in chaos. And here was a boy in a faded hoodie, trying to bridge the gap with nothing but a marker and instinct. He drew arrows between terms, adjusted indices, tightened integrals. His mind flicked between physical intuition and abstract structure. He recalled the way leaves swirled down gutters during Palo Alto rainstorms, the patterns of water splashing from a mop when his father worked the hallways, the sudden collapse of a soap bubble he had studied obsessively in the sink. The world had been teaching him turbulence all his life. Now he sought to compress those lessons into mathematics. The clock ticked, 02:06:45. Sweat dampened his forehead. He pushed forward. His notebook fell open to a page where he had scrawled in all caps, "Simplify the chaos. Listen to the flow." He whispered it under his breath, a mantra to keep his nerves steady. At that moment, he was no longer aware of his father's exhaustion, of his own hunger, of the voices at school that mocked him as the janitor's kid. There was only the equation, the glass board, the light, and the inexorable ticking of the clock. The door beeped faintly. Lockdown sequence initiated. Doors will secure in 10 minutes. Daniel's pulse surged. He worked faster. His solution was not elegant in the classical sense. It was jagged, stitched together, half inspired by rigorous derivations, half born from intuition. He dared to approximate where professors demanded purity, to cut through infinities with a blade of pragmatism. He did not care if the Clay Mathematics Institute would one day disqualify his work from a $1 million prize. All he wanted was coherence, a formula that captured the heartbeat of turbulence, that allowed the chaos to be predicted, if only by a fraction. And as his marker squeaked across the board, that coherence began to take shape. The clock blinked, 02:18. 5 minutes remaining, intoned the automated voice. Daniel's breath came in gasps. His hand cramped but refused to slow. He closed loops of logic, substituted new terms, simplified nested integrals. And then suddenly the equation closed, not in perfection, but in possibility. A path no one else had dared. He dropped the marker, chest heaving. For one suspended moment, the world was silent. Only the servers blinked. Only the white light burned. The door chimed. Lockdown commencing in 60 seconds. Daniel snapped shut his notebook, shoved it into his bag, and ran. His sneakers squealed against the floor. He darted past the lab benches, past the dark shapes of machines that seemed to watch him. The exit loomed ahead, glass doors sliding slowly. 30 seconds, the system announced. He pushed through just as the panels clamped shut behind him with a hiss. The corridor swallowed him. Darkness, then the faint glow of an exit sign. He stopped, panting, pressed his forehead against the cool wall. Behind him, in the sealed lab, the board glowed with its final marks. A janitor's son had written what professors could not. A boy the world ignored had dared to step into silence and make it speak. And no one, at least not yet, knew. The morning after his secret encounter with the equations, Daniel awoke not in a dormitory of red brick Stanford housing, but in a room that smelled faintly of mold and old carpet. The rented apartment in East Palo Alto had once been part of a motel, converted decades ago into low-income housing. Its walls were thin enough that he could hear the upstairs neighbor's alarm clock before his own, a shrill beep, beep, beep that punctured the dawn like a wound. Daniel's mattress lay directly on the floor. Springs poked at his back when he shifted, but he had grown accustomed to the discomfort. What mattered was the notebook under his pillow, still safe, still pressed against his dreams. He reached for it, opened to last night's frantic lines of ink and marker. The symbols danced before his eyes, half mirage, half revelation. He traced them with his finger, whispering as though speaking to an old friend. His father's cough interrupted him. Miguel Alvarez had once been strong, shoulders like stone when he carried Daniel on his back through San Jose playgrounds. Years of scrubbing wax from marble floors had bent those shoulders into permanent fatigue. The cough rattled from his lungs now, muffled through the thin wall separating the kitchenette from Daniel's corner of the apartment. "Daniel, you awake?" his father called. "Yes, Papa." His voice cracked slightly, more from hunger than from sleep. "Come. Eat before school." The school was not Stanford. It was a public high school with cracked linoleum and underfunded classrooms, a place where teachers did their best while resources drained elsewhere. For Daniel, it was both too easy and too difficult. Too easy because the math curriculum felt like reciting the alphabet after he had already written novels of calculus in his notebook. Too difficult because survival there required armor he did not possess. He dressed quickly, faded jeans, a hoodie whose cuffs were unraveling, sneakers donated by a church drive. Each piece of clothing whispered his invisibility. To the other students, he was not Daniel Alvarez the thinker, not the boy who scrawled approximations of turbulence into the night. He was simply the janitor's kid, a role carved for him by rumor and repetition. Breakfast was 2 pieces of toast, slightly burned. His father placed them on a chipped plate and added a thin smear of butter. Beside it, a thermos of lukewarm coffee. "You worked late again?" Daniel asked gently. His father's eyes, ringed with exhaustion, softened. "Floors do not clean themselves, hijo, and Stanford has many floors." Daniel wanted to tell him about the lab last night, about the equations that had finally linked in his mind like constellations, but he knew better. Miguel lived in fear of losing the job that kept them fed. Unauthorized access to research labs was not a story he could risk hearing. Silence became their pact. On the bus to school, Daniel sat by the window, notebook balanced on his knees. The morning fog clung to the glass, blurring the rows of tech offices they passed, logos of companies worth billions, campuses where ideas were currency. He sketched integrals into the margin, tried to hold on to the thread from last night. The turbulence model teased him, offering glimpses of structure, then dissolving. A voice cut in. "Hey, genius, still playing pretend?" It was Mark, a linebacker with shoulders that filled the aisle. His grin carried no humor. He snatched at the notebook, but Daniel clutched it tight. The pages bent under pressure. "Give it back," Daniel said, quieter than he wished. "What's this crap anyway? Greek letters? You think you're smarter than everyone else?" Mark's laugh was joined by a chorus from his friends. Daniel said nothing. To argue would be to invite bruises. He pressed the notebook tighter to his chest until the bus lurched to a stop, forcing Mark to let go. Daniel slipped off at his stop without looking back. At school, invisibility deepened. In the cafeteria, he sat alone. In class, he answered questions softly, sometimes too softly for teachers to notice. When he did speak clearly, some classmates rolled their eyes, muttering "teacher's pet," or worse. He learned that silence was safer than truth. Yet silence was also suffocating. During lunch, he retreated to the library. Its fluorescent lights were harsh, but between stacks of dusty science books he found a sanctuary. There, he copied notes from old physics texts, layering them with insights scavenged from online forums he accessed on outdated school computers. To most students, the library was a detention center for boredom. To Daniel, It was a portal to Stanford, to the world beyond. One afternoon, while poring over a volume on computational fluid dynamics, he felt a shadow fall across the page. "You're Alvarez, right? Miguel's kid?" He looked up. It was Ms. Carter, the physics teacher. Her hair was tied in a bun that frayed at the edges, glasses slipping down her nose. Unlike other teachers, she looked at him not with dismissal, but with curiosity. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said cautiously. "I've noticed your test papers." She tapped the book. "You work at a level beyond this curriculum. Where are you getting this?" Daniel hesitated. If he told her the truth, sneaking into labs at night, copying equations from research boards, she might report him, so he deflected. "I just like to read." Her eyes narrowed, but she did not press. "Keep reading then. But remember, knowledge is a tool. It matters how you use it." The words lingered in him, both encouragement and warning. After school, Daniel often walked past Stanford before taking the bus home. He lingered near the edges of campus, where modern glass buildings gleamed like cathedrals. Through tall windows, he glimpsed students laughing, professors gesturing at equations, researchers huddled over prototypes. He pressed his hand against the cold glass of the engineering building once, imagining what it would be like to belong. To walk inside not as a ghost at 2 a.m., but as a rightful student. A security guard coughed nearby, and Daniel withdrew. He had learned to vanish quickly, blending into shadows, slipping away like mist. That evening, his father returned later than usual. His uniform shirt reeked faintly of cleaning chemicals. He dropped onto the couch, massaging his wrists. Daniel warmed leftover rice on the stove, dividing it carefully so each bowl held the same portion. Miguel smiled tiredly. "You should not worry about me. Study hard. One day, maybe you will not clean floors." Daniel forced a smile. One day. He could not say the truth. That he already studied harder than anyone knew, that he already carried solutions no one had imagined. Because to reveal himself was to risk everything, the fragile balance of survival they maintained. Late that night, after his father's snores filled the small apartment, Daniel lit a desk lamp and opened his notebook again. He reviewed the equations from the lab, refining them, questioning his own steps. He drew diagrams of vortices, arrows spiraling into chaos. He scribbled possible optimizations for AI algorithms he had overheard Stanford students discussing. Outside, sirens wailed faintly. Inside, the pages filled with symbols. And though he felt invisible in daylight, in these hours, he was something else. A guardian of hidden knowledge, a child woven into the fabric of impossibility. Invisibility had become his armor. Yet deep inside, Daniel knew it could not last. The world would one day collide with his secrets. Whether it crushed him or carried him, he did not yet know. But he wrote as though the equations themselves demanded it, as though each line was a lifeline thrown across the abyss. The night pressed on. His lamp burned, and within the margins of a battered notebook, the invisible child prepared to change the fate of science. The night returned like an old secret. Stanford's campus slept beneath the hush of California fog, its arches and quads softened by the moon. A stray breeze rattled eucalyptus leaves, carrying the faint scent of oil and metal from the nearby labs. Somewhere, a clock struck midnight. Daniel waited until the last janitor's cart rattled down the hall. He knew the cadence of their shifts now, the echo of wheels and the clatter of buckets across tile. His father had warned him 1,000 times, "Do not wander where you don't belong." But the equations had become more than temptation. They were a summons. When the corridors emptied, Daniel slipped inside. The lab greeted him with the same sterile glow, the same machines suspended in slumber. The automatic doors sighed shut behind him, sealing him once more in the tomb of invention. On the glass board, faint smudges still lingered from his work 2 nights earlier. Professors had erased most of it, as they always did, yet ghostly remnants clung like scars. He traced one with his finger. A curve, an index. A boundary condition left imperfectly wiped away. Every mark, his father once said, tells a story. Daniel leaned close. To most eyes, these streaks were accidents of a lazy erasure. To him, they were messages, breadcrumbs left behind by minds greater than his, minds that had wrestled with the turbulence monster and surrendered. He set down his notebook, opened to a blank page, and began copying the faint patterns before they vanished forever. The traces were not limited to glass boards. They lived in forgotten corners of the lab, printouts half-shredded in recycling bins, diagrams pinned to corkboards with dates months old, coffee-stained sticky notes curled at the edges. Daniel had become an archaeologist of genius. One evening, he found a scribbled margin on the back of a fluid mechanics paper. A professor had written, "Boundary layer collapse equals key," or dead end. Another time, he discovered an unlabeled USB drive discarded in a drawer, its files corrupted. Yet fragments of code peeked through, lines of a failed optimization routine, loops that spiraled into infinities. Daniel copied them into his notebook, not knowing whether they were poison or cure. The world thought him invisible, but here, among ghosts of equations, he felt seen. He sat at a workstation, an abandoned terminal humming faintly. The screen flickered with a login request, demanding credentials he did not possess. He bypassed it the way children bypass fences, not by force, but by looking where adults never looked. A maintenance account, left unwatched, let him peer into folders of failed simulations. Graphs stretched across the screen, jagged lines climbing into chaos. He scrolled through terabytes of disappointment, thousands of attempts by Stanford's brightest to tame turbulence, each ending in collapse. Yet in the ruins, Daniel noticed patterns. The failures all stumbled at the same point, boundary conditions near singularities. It was like watching runners trip at the same crack in the track. He scribbled in his notebook. It is not the equation that fails, it is the lens we use to see it. The clock on the wall read 01:47. He had barely over 10 minutes before the first security sweep. The automatic announcement would soon begin. Lockdown commencing in 20 minutes. Daniel's pulse quickened. He moved to the glass board, uncapped a marker, and began to rebuild the fragments. He copied the faded smudges, the sticky note questions, the corrupted code, threading them together into something new. It was not orderly. His lines zigzagged, his handwriting tilted, arrows pointed in wild directions. But within the chaos, coherence began to emerge. He drew a vortex, spirals shrinking inward. Beneath it, he wrote, "Self-similar structures, fractal scaling law." He linked it to a partial derivative term, boxed it twice, then paused to listen, to the hum of machines, to the silent insistence of the equations themselves. For a moment, it felt as though the lab leaned in to watch. Memories intruded. The sound of water sloshing in his father's mop bucket. The whirl of leaves down storm drains. The hiss of buses braking in the rain. Turbulence was everywhere. It had always surrounded him, disguised as ordinary life. Professors approached it with million-dollar grants. Daniel approached it with childhood. He closed his eyes and remembered the gutter in front of their apartment, where rainwater carved miniature canyons through gravel. He had once knelt for hours, sketching the eddies with a stick, mapping their unpredictable dance. Now, he wrote the same curves into mathematics. The board filled with symbols, yet time drained faster. The digital clock blinked 01:58. "Lockdown commencing in 2 minutes," the system chimed. Daniel's breath shortened. His hand cramped around the marker. He scrawled one last equation, a wild synthesis of fluid dynamics and fractal geometry, then slammed the cap shut. The lab lights dimmed in warning. He bolted for the door, backpack thumping against his ribs. The panels hissed open just long enough for him to squeeze through. Behind him, the lab sealed tight. Back in the dorm corridors, he leaned against the cold wall, heart pounding. His notebook bulged with new fragments. His hoodie clung with sweat. Invisibility was his curse, but it was also his shield. No one suspected the janitor's son carried the traces of Stanford's failures in his bag. No one knew he had begun to weave them into a tapestry no professor had dared. And yet, he felt it, like static in the air, that the traces left behind were not just clues. They were invitations. Invitations to finish what others had abandoned. He whispered into the empty hall, "I will not let the board forget me." Then he disappeared into the night, carrying the ruins of genius toward a destiny only he could see. Knowledge for Daniel was never given whole. It arrived in shards. While other students purchased gleaming new textbooks or downloaded PDFs from university portals, Daniel scavenged the edges of academia like a forager combing through ruins. His classroom was the library discard pile, the recycling bins outside research labs, the whispered fragments of lectures he overheard while emptying trash cans with his father. Each shard cut him, sometimes with the sting of confusion, sometimes with the deeper wound of not belonging. Yet when pieced together, they formed a mosaic more powerful than any curriculum. He remembered the first shard vividly, a single page caught under his sneaker when he was 10. The wind had carried it across the quad. On one side, faint coffee stains. On the other, a line of equations he did not understand. Partial derivatives, fluid velocities, pressure gradients. He had folded it into his pocket, carried it home, and stared at it for hours as though it were a treasure map. His father, seeing the boy bent over the page by lamplight, had shaken his head. "Daniel, it's trash." "No," Daniel whispered. "It's a doorway." That page became the seed. Over the years, more fragments joined it. A half-torn notebook left in the lost and found box, filled with integrals scrawled in haste. Daniel copied every symbol, even the ones smudged beyond recognition, then tried to reconstruct them like broken bones. A printout of a research proposal, stamped "rejected" across the front, describing computational turbulence models. The rejection was brutal, but the appendices overflowed with methods and code. Daniel read it like scripture. A professor's discarded chalkboard sketch glimpsed while he mopped, 4 vectors meeting at a point, arrows curling into eddies. Daniel memorized it in seconds, etched it later onto a napkin, then onto the back of his notebook. At the public library, another trove awaited. Old journals sold for pennies in the withdrawn section. Daniel bought them with quarters earned from helping neighbors carry groceries. Fluid Mechanics Quarterly, 1997. Proceedings of Computational Mathematics, 1982. Yellowed pages, outdated references, yet inside were ideas still alive, waiting to be reborn. He carried them home like relics. There were nights when the apartment floor disappeared beneath piles of journals. Miguel would sigh, stepping carefully between stacks. "One day we will drown in paper, hijo." Daniel would smile faintly. "If we drown, it will be in knowledge." The shards did not always fit neatly. Often they contradicted one another, equations clashing, assumptions diverging. Professors in one era dismissed what another era celebrated. But Daniel learned to live in contradictions. He treated them like turbulence itself, chaotic, unpredictable, yet full of hidden patterns. Where others saw irreconcilable noise, he searched for resonance. It was this habit of piecing together contradictions that shaped his thinking into something no single textbook could provide. At school, his teachers noticed only glimpses. In physics class, Ms. Carter once asked, "Daniel, how would you describe laminar versus turbulent flow?" While most students repeated textbook definitions, Daniel closed his eyes. "Laminar is like soldiers marching in lines. Turbulent is like children spilling into a playground, every path colliding, yet still contained by the fence." The class laughed, but Ms. Carter blinked, unsettled by the precision hidden in his metaphor. She did not press further, but she knew he was speaking from a well she could not see. The shards also came from voices, graduate students in hoodies, arguing outside cafes about machine learning optimizers. Daniel, sweeping floors nearby, scribbled phrases on receipts. Stochastic gradient descent, vanishing gradients, overfitting. Professors in lecture halls, microphones faintly leaking through doors. He pressed his ear against the wood, catching fragments. Navier-Stokes. Unsolved. Millennium Prize. Boundary conditions. Even his father contributed unwittingly. The rhythm of a mop dragging water across tile, the pattern of foam swirling in a bucket. Daniel translated them into visual lessons on flow and dissipation. The world was a textbook, if one listened. But shards are heavy. They filled his notebooks until the spines cracked. They filled his mind until sleep became elusive. Equations whispered to him in dreams, symbols rearranging themselves into spirals and vortices. Some nights he woke in panic, heart racing, afraid he had lost the thread. Other nights, he woke smiling, certain he had glimpsed the skeleton of turbulence itself. He had no professor to confirm his insights, no peer to challenge his assumptions. Loneliness was the tax of hidden genius. Yet loneliness also meant freedom. Freedom to build without permission, to stitch shards into shapes no one else dared imagine. One evening, after a brutal day at school filled with taunts and silence, Daniel retreated to the library. He found an old monograph on fractal geometry. Its pages spoke of self-similarity, of infinite patterns repeating within themselves. His eyes widened. Here was a language for what he had always seen in turbulence. The whirlpool within whirlpool, the echo of a storm inside a raindrop. He scribbled in his notebook. Fractal scaling law plus Navier-Stokes, bridge. It was a shard unlike any other, the first true key. From then on, every shard he gathered passed through the lens of fractals. A sticky note about boundary collapse became a clue to self-similarity. A corrupted code loop became a hint at recursive structures. Even the gutter outside his apartment, where rain carved spirals, looked suddenly like evidence of a deeper symmetry. His notebooks thickened with drawings, spirals upon spirals, equations nested like Russian dolls. The fragments, once scattered, began to align into constellations. Daniel whispered to himself, "Chaos remembers itself." Yet with each breakthrough came danger. The more shards he pieced together, the more he risked discovery. If professors realized someone was trespassing, if his father learned he had been sneaking into labs, the fragile world they survived on could collapse. And yet Daniel could not stop. Knowledge had become not just hunger, but survival. To leave the shards unused would be to betray them. That night, as fog curled around Stanford's silent buildings, Daniel sat in the lab once more. He spread his notebook across the desk, shards of equations blazing under fluorescent light. Every discarded scrap, every overheard phrase, every line half erased from a chalkboard, he had carried them here. They no longer felt like ruins. They felt like weapons. The shards of knowledge had become his arsenal, and with them, he would fight turbulence itself. Silence has a weight, and in the Stanford laboratory at 2 o'clock in the morning, it pressed down like an invisible hand. The automatic doors had sighed shut behind him once again, sealing the boy inside. Outside, the world slept. Inside, the fluorescent tubes cast their unflinching light, turning every surface sterile, every shadow sharp. Machines towered like monuments, their diodes blinking faintly as though marking time with indifferent heartbeats. Daniel placed his notebook on the desk and stood before the glass board. His reflection met him there, a thin boy in a faded hoodie, dark hair falling into tired eyes. For a moment he simply stared. Then he lifted the marker. The first stroke broke the silence. Squeak. It echoed louder than it should have, bouncing off steel benches and empty chairs, writing in silence. It was a ritual now. The outside world had laughter, insults, clamor. This world had only the sound of ink against glass. Each stroke was a rebellion against invisibility, a declaration made to no audience but the humming servers. Tonight he aimed not for fragments. Tonight he sought structure. He began with the Navier-Stokes equations, laying them out as though building a skeleton. Terms of velocity, pressure, and viscosity aligned like bones. Then he added flesh, approximations from fractal geometry, scaling laws whispered by the spirals he had traced in rain gutters. Symbols filled the board. He wrote quickly but not recklessly. Every line carried the weight of nights spent hunched in libraries, ears pressed to classroom doors, eyes memorizing chalkboards glimpsed through half-open doors. His breathing matched the rhythm of his strokes. Inhale, exhale, write. The silence was not empty. It was alive. He heard the faint tick of the wall clock. 01:52. The low drone of the cooling fans. The whisper of his own breath fogging the glass. It was as if the universe had stripped itself down to essentials, equation and time. Nothing else mattered. Focus, he murmured to himself, though no one was there to hear. He sketched a vortex, arrowed lines curling into spirals. Beneath it, he scribbled, energy cascade, fractal invariance. The cascade was key. Energy poured from large structures into smaller ones, each swirl birthing tinier swirls, turbulence feeding on itself, infinite regress, infinite unpredictability. But what if the cascade obeyed hidden symmetry? What if the chaos carried its own compass? Daniel leaned closer, pressing harder with the marker, his handwriting slanting under urgency. The board squealed with each stroke, as though resisting the audacity of a janitor's son daring to tame turbulence. The clock flicked forward, 01:56. "Lockdown in 15 minutes," intoned the mechanical voice. Daniel flinched but did not stop. Time was his constant adversary. It forced precision where hesitation would have lived. It cut through doubt like a blade. He wrote faster, his lines merging into a lattice. Terms canceled, others multiplied. He sliced infinities down with substitutions, not out of arrogance but desperation. He knew he could be wrong, horribly wrong, but the silence demanded he continue. His hand cramped. He shook it out, then pressed on. Every mark pulled memory to the surface. The mop, sloshing in his father's bucket, modeled as dissipation. The leaves in a storm drain, vortices decaying into vortices. The sound of cafeteria laughter, noise collapsing into patterns of cruelty, turbulence of another kind. All of it entered the mathematics. Nothing in his life was wasted. Every insult, every drop of water, every shadow in the hallway became data. He whispered, "The world has already solved it. I am only listening." By 02:00, the board was crowded. Equations overlapped, arrows tangled, notes layered like palimpsests. To anyone else, it was madness. To Daniel, it was music. He paused, staring at what he had written. His reflection stared back, warped by symbols, as though the boy himself had become an equation among equations. In that silence, doubt surged. What if this is nothing? What if all I have built is illusion? The weight of invisibility pressed harder. No professor stood beside him. No journal awaited his submission. If he vanished tonight, his work would vanish too, erased by a sponge, swept into the recycling bin, forgotten like all the shards before. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. Then he remembered his father's words. Every mark tells a story. Even when erased, the board remembers. The silence answered. He began again. He boxed his fractal term, connected it to the Navier-Stokes skeleton. Something clicked. A pathway emerged, crude, but real. He could approximate turbulence not as noise but as self-similar echoes, predict chaos by embracing its pattern. He laughed once, softly, an exhale more than a sound. The silence absorbed it without echo. "Lockdown in 5 minutes," the system warned. Daniel's pulse hammered. He scribbled the final substitution, closed the loop of logic. His handwriting faltered, but the equation stood whole. For one suspended moment, he dropped the marker. His hand shook. His chest ached. The silence broke not with applause, not with validation, but with stillness so profound it felt like reverence. The board glowed with the last strokes of ink. The boy stared, breathless, at the shape of possibility. The announcement chimed again. "Lockdown commencing in 60 seconds. Daniel lunged for his notebook, copying as fast as his cramping hand allowed. Numbers blurred, ink smudged. Yet the essence made it onto the page. He stuffed the notebook into his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and sprinted for the door. 30 seconds. The automatic doors yawned open, indifferent. He slipped through, sneakers squealing against polished tile. The doors sealed behind him. The lab fell dark, silent once more. But inside, on the glass board, a lattice of equations waited, written in silence, born of fragments, daring to defy impossibility. Daniel collapsed against the corridor wall, panting. His notebook throbbed with fresh ink. His reflection in the exit sign looked older than 15, older than the years he had lived. He whispered into the silence of the hallway, "When the world finally listens, I will already have spoken." The Stanford laboratory was not silent tonight. It was ticking. On the wall, the digital clock glowed a relentless red, 0150 Urxio. Each second fell like a hammer. Beneath it, the automated voice recited with machine calm, "Lockdown sequence will begin in 10 minutes. To most researchers, this was routine. To Daniel, it was a noose. He gripped the marker harder, his knuckles pale. The board before him stretched like a battlefield, equations sprawled in frantic arcs. He had come too far to abandon it now, but the countdown devoured him, every second slicing away certainty. 015112. The first substitution collapsed neatly, terms canceling in symmetry he had only dreamed of. His pulse raced. He scribbled notes in his battered notebook, copying furiously. 015244. The air vents hummed louder, mocking his panic. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, writing faster, compressing hours of thought into seconds. 0154 Onquao. His hoodie clung with sweat. His legs trembled. The silence of earlier chapters was gone. Now there was rhythm, a percussion of clock and pen and heartbeat. The lab was no longer mausoleum. It was Colosseum. He remembered the first time he was locked in, years ago, when he hid under a desk after cleaning with his father. The lights had gone out, the doors had sealed, and the boy had cried until a guard found him. That memory flared now, adding terror to urgency. But this time he would not cry. This time he would fight the countdown with numbers. 01, 55, 30. Daniel boxed a fractal term, tied it to Navier-Stokes. His marker squealed against glass, leaving lines jagged with haste. His mantra returned, "Simplify the chaos. Listen to the flow." He whispered it through clenched teeth, writing like a man possessed. The cascade of energy, the monster of turbulence, shrank beneath his equations, not conquered, but cornered. 01:57 wall. Lockdown commencing in 3 minutes. The voice was cold, merciless. Daniel's hand cramped. He switched markers, tossing the empty one aside. Its clatter echoing across metal benches. He inhaled sharply, grounding himself. This was more than math. This was survival. 01:58:20. For a moment, doubt struck. The lattice blurred, logic tangled. What if he had followed a false trail? What if the countdown ended and all he left behind was nonsense? But then he remembered the shards, the sticky notes, the torn pages, the whispers behind doors. Every fragment had led here. Trust the fragments, he told himself. They brought you this far. He bent lower, refining the term, and the blur resolved into clarity. The lattice aligned. 01:59 Oka. 2 minutes remaining. His heart thudded in sync with the clock. The lab's fluorescent lights dimmed fractionally. A warning. Shadows stretched across the floor like grasping fingers. He pushed harder. Ink streaked. Symbols collided. Yet the equation neared closure. 01:59:40. 1 minute remaining. Daniel slammed the final substitution onto the board, connecting vortex spirals to boundary collapse. For an instant, silence returned. Not the tranquil silence of earlier nights, but the stunned pause before revelation. He had done it. Not perfection, not proof, but possibility. The Navier-Stokes monster no longer sneered from infinity. It stared back, wounded, mapped by a boy no one believed in. The voice cut through. Lockdown commencing in 30 seconds. Daniel jolted back into his body. His backpack lay open on the bench, his notebook half filled with scribbles. The doors already hissed, preparing to seal. He lunged, copying frantically, lines smudging under desperate hands. Sweat dripped onto the page. 20 seconds. He jammed the notebook into his bag, zipped it with shaking fingers. 10 seconds. He ran. The corridor blurred. His sneakers slapped the tile. His breath tore at his throat. The doors ahead began to slide, steel and glass converging like jaws. 5 seconds. Daniel hurled himself forward, arms pumping. 3. He squeezed through just as the doors clamped shut, the hiss of pressure sealing the lab behind him. Silence again. Not in the lab, but in the hallway. His body collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, ears ringing with the ghost of the countdown. The board inside still glowed with his marks. The servers still hummed like indifferent witnesses. Daniel whispered into the dark corridor, voice cracked but defiant. The monster has a face now. He staggered into the night, notebook heavy against his spine. The countdown had ended, but its echo remained inside him. Every second had been a blade at his throat, and yet he had carved through with equations. For the first time, he felt not invisible, but inevitable. And though no one else knew it yet, the countdown had not been to a lockdown. It had been to the birth of something new. The night had teeth, and they were closing. Inside the Stanford laboratory, the countdown was nearly done. The walls hummed with the voice of the system. Lockdown commencing in 1 minute. Red lights blinked in rhythm, casting long shadows over glass and steel. Daniel stood before the board, hand trembling. His lungs burned from hours of shallow breaths. Sweat streaked down his temple. He had written himself to the edge of exhaustion, yet the equation stood incomplete, its last line dangling like a bridge unfinished. He whispered aloud, to no one and to everything. One more step. Just one. The board glared back at him, covered in symbols that would have terrified most mathematicians. Lines of Navier-Stokes terms collided with fractal cascades, arrows linking dissipation to symmetry. It was madness woven into coherence, a tapestry stitched from shards. But the final term resisted. His hand hovered, his vision blurred. The marker slipped in his grasp. The clock glowed. 01:59:10. 50 seconds. Daniel forced himself to focus. He remembered the gutter water outside his apartment, spinning into spirals. He remembered soap bubbles collapsing, rain pooling around his sneakers, mop water sloshing in buckets. The world had been tutoring him in turbulence all his life. He lifted the marker again. "Listen," he murmured, "and write." The silence deepened. Even the servers seemed to hold their breath. 01:59:25. He scrawled a substitution, reckless yet guided. The cascade of energy snapped into place. 01:59:30. He drew the boundary condition, anchoring the infinite regress. 01:59:40. He boxed the final fractal term, circled it twice, and slammed the marker down. The equation was whole, not proven, not perfect, but alive. For 1 second, Daniel stood motionless, chest heaving, eyes wide. The silence of the lab was no longer oppressive. It was reverent, like a cathedral after prayer. He had carved a face into the monster of turbulence. Then the voice cut through. "Lockdown commencing in 20 seconds. Panic roared back. The doors were already narrowing, glass sliding toward steel. The lights dimmed, shadows lengthening like claws. Daniel snatched his notebook, tore across the room. His sneakers squealed on polished tile. His backpack thumped against his ribs. 15 seconds. He hurdled a chair, nearly tripping, then caught himself on the bench. His breath tore at his throat. 10 seconds. The doors hissed, narrowing to a slit. "Please," he gasped. "Please." 5 seconds. He lunged. The corridor loomed beyond, salvation wrapped in sterile light. He flung his body forward, arms outstretched. 3 seconds. The doors clamped. He slipped through by a hair, his backpack scraping glass. The hiss of sealed pressure slammed behind him, cutting off the lab like a tomb. He landed hard on the corridor floor, palms stinging, knees aching. For a moment, the world spun. Then he laughed, breathless, ragged, unbelieving. The hall was silent except for his gasps. The exit sign glowed red above him. Behind the sealed glass, the board still burned with ink. No one had seen him. No one knew. Yet he carried in his backpack a notebook that now contained a possibility the world had sought for centuries. He pressed his forehead against the cool wall, tears mixing with sweat. His body shook, not from fear, but from release. He whispered, "The leap is done." Outside, the night was cold. Fog curled around the quads, cloaking towers in ghostly white. Daniel staggered across the empty campus, each step heavier than the last. His legs trembled, his lungs begged for rest, but his spirit surged. He had written the impossible. He had leapt from invisibility to inevitability. And though the world did not yet know his name, he knew. The final leap was not just escape, it was entry. The board behind him bore his mark. The future ahead of him awaited its echo. Morning arrived with a gentleness the night had not known. Fog rolled over the Stanford campus, blurring palm trees into pale silhouettes. The towers caught the first rays of sunlight, glowing like monuments carved from cloud. Students trickled in, backpacks slung, laughter carried on the crisp air. But inside the engineering complex, silence reigned. The lab was still sealed from its midnight lockdown, its doors awaiting the coded swipe of an authorized hand. At 8:07 a.m., Professor Adrian Keller arrived. Keller was a man carved by decades of research, his beard silvered, his shoulders stooped from endless nights over chalkboards. Once lauded as a rising star in fluid mechanics, he now bore the weariness of battles lost against turbulence. Grants had come and gone, each leaving him with more equations and fewer answers. He swiped his badge. The doors sighed open. The fluorescent lights flickered on, and Keller stepped into the stillness. He smelled faint traces of disinfectant and ozone, the sterile perfume of machines at rest. Then he saw the board. At first he thought it was the same chaos left behind every week. Graduate students scribbling half-proofs, scrawling hypotheses that collapsed by morning. He set his briefcase on the bench, ready to erase the mess, when something halted him. The equations were different. Not cleaner, not polished, but alive. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Navier-Stokes' terms sprawled across the glass, but they were not abandoned. They were closed. Fractals spiraled into boundary conditions. Scaling laws tied vortices into coherence. It was crude, jagged, even reckless, but it was whole. Keller froze. For 30 years, turbulence had mocked him. He had supervised doctoral students who came and went, brilliant minds who flared bright and then extinguished under the weight of the unsolved. He had watched funding slip toward AI startups, while his equations collected dust. Now, before him, was something he could not name. Not a solution, perhaps, but a pathway. A wound in the monster of turbulence that bled possibility. His hands trembled. He pressed his palm against the glass as though touch could confirm reality. He whispered, "Who did this?" No signature adorned the board. No initials, no ID numbers. Only jagged handwriting, uneven strokes, symbols boxed and circled with urgency. The work of someone who had written under pressure, racing against time. Keller's eyes flicked to the security camera in the corner. It blinked red, recording as always. He knew he could request the feed. But something in him hesitated. Would knowing ruin the mystery? He sank into a chair, notebook unopened in his lap. His mind raced faster than in years. The boxed fractal term, could it be applied to atmospheric models? The substitution on the lower left, was it reckless genius or dangerous nonsense? He scribbled notes in the margin of a napkin, tracing the pathway left by an invisible hand. Again and again he asked himself, which of my students attempted this? Which postdoc dared this leap? But deep down, Keller sensed the truth. None of them had the audacity. None of them wrote with such raw conviction. This was not the hand of academia. It was the hand of desperation. By noon, whispers had begun. A graduate assistant entered to deliver files, glimpsed the board, and froze. "Professor, who?" "Quiet!" Keller snapped, harsher than he meant. His eyes never left the equations. The assistant backed out, pale, as though glimpsing forbidden scripture. Within hours, the rumor spread. By late afternoon, half the department had heard of the board in Keller's lab. By evening, 2 colleagues arrived, pretending to drop by casually, but their eyes betrayed hunger. One muttered, "It looks impossible." Another whispered, "It looks inevitable." Keller stayed late, alone again as night fell. He could not erase it. He could not replicate it. He could only stare, torn between awe and fear. A thought gnawed at him. If this was real, if it held even partial truth, it could change everything. Aviation, climate modeling, energy systems, fields shackled by turbulence for centuries could be freed, and yet no one claimed it. Who writes brilliance and then vanishes? The professor finally requested the security feed. He watched grainy footage flicker across his screen. At first, empty hallways, the lab sealed. Then, at 01:40 a.m., the doors slid open. Keller leaned forward. The figure was small, thin. A boy, not a man. A hoodie swallowed his frame. His sneakers squeaked faintly as he entered, backpack sagging with weight. He set down a notebook, uncapped a marker. For the next 20 minutes, Keller watched, mouth dry, as the boy wrote. There was no hesitation, no committee deliberation, no academic caution. Only relentless strokes, symbols scrawled with ferocity, as though the board itself were on fire. At 01:59:55, the boy lunged through the doors just as they sealed. The feed ended. Keller sat back, stunned. A child. A ghost. He whispered, "How long have you been haunting us?" The lab was silent. The board glowed with its jagged lattice. Keller rubbed his eyes. If this boy existed, this phantom, then the hierarchy of academia meant nothing. Genius had slipped past gates and badges and credentials, leaving professors as witnesses instead of authors. It humbled him. It terrified him. It exhilarated him. He knew one thing: the board could not be erased. He ordered the department to preserve it under glass, like a relic. He told colleagues it was for further analysis, but privately, he felt it was sacrament. Still, one question carved itself into him, deeper each day. Who was the child? And though he did not yet know, he felt the truth. Somewhere in the shadows of Stanford, invisible hands had written the beginning of an answer humanity had chased for centuries. The eyes that discovered could not look away. By the end of that week, the rumor had outgrown the lab. It began as whispers in hallways, graduate students glancing nervously at the board in Professor Keller's lab, professors lowering their voices when discussing the phantom derivation. Then it spilled into cafeterias, then into the echoing courtyards of Stanford itself. By the second week, it had a name: the Ghost of Stanford Lab. The story spread with the velocity of wildfire. Someone had broken into a sealed research laboratory in the middle of the night, left behind equations that danced closer to solving turbulence than anything the faculty had seen in decades, and vanished. No ID, no fingerprints, no trace, except for brilliance. Students speculated with fervor. Some insisted it was an eccentric postdoc, hiding work to test the department's vigilance. Others claimed it was a prank, an elaborate forgery. But those who had seen the board in person knew better. There was conviction in those strokes, urgency in the handwriting. This was not parody. This was revelation. News reached the administration. Meetings convened behind closed doors. Should they announce, suppress, pursue? Keller argued to preserve the work. If it is a prank, it is a brilliant one. If it is genuine, we are staring at history. His colleagues nodded reluctantly, but outside those rooms, the hunt had already begun. Security combed through camera logs. At first, they saw nothing unusual, but Keller already knew. He had watched the grainy feed, a boy in a hoodie, small, fragile, relentless. He did not share that detail, not yet. But Stanford was porous. Secrets leaked. By the third week, the rumor reached the press. A technology blog ran the headline, "Unsolved Equation Solved? Mystery Genius Haunts Stanford Lab." The article featured blurred stills from the security feed. a thin figure bent over the board, face obscured by shadow. They circled it in red, titled it, "The Ghost." The story went viral overnight. Daniel read the article in the library, heart pounding. His face wasn't visible, but his outline was. The backpack, the hoodie, the stooped posture of someone who had carried too much weight too young. He closed the browser quickly, but the words burned into him. Mystery genius, phantom mathematician, Stanford ghost. He whispered to himself, "They can't know. They mustn't know." Because to be found was to be exposed, and exposure meant ruin for his father's job, for their fragile survival, for the little life they had built among shadows. But the world was not merciful. By the fourth week, journalists camped outside the engineering building. Television crews filmed segments against Stanford's sandstone arches. Professors dodged questions, students speculated for cameras, administrators offered nothing. Still, the myth grew. Some said the ghost was a disgruntled Nobel laureate, too disillusioned to publish under his own name. Others claimed it was an AI gone rogue, writing on boards while humans slept. The most romantic insisted it was the ghost of Leonhard Euler himself, returning to finish turbulence. The truth was stranger. A 15-year-old boy carrying a mop bucket's worth of memories and a notebook of scraps. Daniel's invisibility became both shield and prison. At school, no one connected him to the headlines. He remained the janitor's kid, bullied, overlooked, dismissed. He walked hallways where no one cared that the world beyond was whispering his existence. But each night, he shook with fear. What if Keller revealed the footage? What if the world decided to hunt harder? He clutched his notebook tighter, as though the pages could erase him if necessary. Meanwhile, Keller fought his own battle. His colleagues pressed him. "Who was it, Adrian? You've seen the footage." He deflected. "Anonymous brilliance deserves time. To rush is to destroy." But he was restless. He scoured the footage frame by frame. He magnified the boy's hands, thin, ink-stained. He studied the backpack, frayed at the seams. He examined the sneakers, worn at the soles. These were not the accoutrements of faculty, nor of wealthy undergraduates. This was someone from the margins. The hunt grew wider. Alumni whispered at dinner parties. Venture capitalists speculated at conferences. "If Stanford's ghost is real," one billionaire said, "then he's the most valuable mind in Silicon Valley." The word valuable struck like a curse, because genius attracts not only admiration, but appetite. By the fifth week, Daniel noticed strangers in his neighborhood. Men in suits walking streets where no one wore suits. Cars idling longer than usual near the bus stop. He lowered his hood, walked faster, clutched his notebook close. He told himself it was paranoia, but paranoia was survival. At night, he avoided the lab. To return now would be to invite capture. Instead, he worked by lamplight in his cramped apartment, refining his equations, stitching shards into clearer patterns. His father wondered at his exhaustion, but did not ask. Silence had always been their pact. And yet, Daniel felt the pull of the board. Each night he dreamed of the lab, of the glass glowing with his frantic scrawl. He woke with his hands twitching, as though still holding the marker. The ghost was not only hunted by the world, he was hunted by his own work, calling him back to finish. At Stanford, Keller made a decision. He called a departmental meeting. "This ghost, whoever they are," he said, "is not a threat. They are a gift. We must not treat them as criminal, but as collaborator." The room erupted in dissent. "You can't be serious. Breaking into a lab is not collaboration. What if it's a hoax?" Keller raised his voice. "If it is a hoax, it is the most brilliant hoax I've ever seen. If it is not, then history has already changed. Do you want Stanford remembered as the place that erased genius, or the place that recognized it? The room fell silent. But outside that room, the hunt only intensified. News anchors spoke of the boy who wrote the impossible. Online forums dissected screenshots, enhancing pixels, debating the slope of his shoulders, the length of his fingers. Conspiracy theories flourished. That the ghost was an orphan trained by the CIA, that he was a time traveler, that he was not human at all. The myth outpaced the truth. And Daniel, walking home through Palo Alto fog, whispered to himself, "I am not a ghost. I am a boy." But the world no longer believed him. The hunt was on. The myth could not last forever. For weeks, the ghost had lived only in whispers, in blurry screenshots, in the trembling awe of those who stood before the board. But myths are fragile things. They either fade or become flesh. Daniel's myth chose the latter. It began with a mistake. One Friday afternoon, after another long day of silence at school, Daniel boarded the bus home. His backpack sagged with the weight of notebooks, the zipper half broken. As the bus jolted over a pothole, a page slipped loose. It fluttered like a wounded bird to the aisle floor. A classmate picked it up. "What's this?" Equations stared back. Dense, sprawling, fractal spirals married to Navier-Stokes terms. Symbols no high schooler should have written. The boy laughed. "Yo, Alvarez thinks he's Einstein." But a teacher on the bus glanced over, her eyes sharpened. She knew enough mathematics to recognize this was not child's play. She kept the page. By Monday, it had found its way to the principal, then, through a chain of whispers and phone calls, to Professor Keller himself. Keller arrived at the school 3 days later. His silver beard caught the light of fluorescent hallways, his reputation preceding him like a rumor of thunder. Students gawked. Teachers fell silent. He asked for Daniel. The janitor's son was summoned from physics class. He stepped into the hallway, clutching his battered backpack like a shield. For the first time, Daniel met the eyes that had discovered his work. Keller studied the boy, thin, pale, hands ink-stained, nails bitten, a hoodie too small for his frame, sneakers splitting at the seams. Not the image of genius that the world demanded, but Keller's instincts, honed over decades, whispered the truth. "You wrote this," Keller said, holding the page. Daniel swallowed hard. Silence pressed like a vice. To admit was to betray his father, to risk everything. To deny was to erase himself. He whispered, almost inaudible, "Yes." The revelation spread faster than rumor ever had. By evening, Keller had informed the department. By morning, the press swarmed the school gates. Cameras flashed. Headlines screamed, "Stanford ghost identified. Janitor's son solves the impossible." Journalists shoved microphones toward the boy who tried to hide behind his father's worn jacket. Reporters demanded, "How did you do it? Why did you do it? Who taught you?" Daniel said nothing. His father stood beside him, bewildered, shielding him as best he could. The university convened an emergency press conference. Keller stood at the podium first. His voice carried the solemnity of confession. "We have witnessed brilliance that defies classification. The individual who advanced the turbulence equations was not a professor, not a postdoctoral fellow, not even a Stanford student. He is a 15-year-old boy, the son of one of our maintenance workers. His name is Daniel Alvarez." Gasps rippled through the hall. Cameras clicked like rain. Then they brought Daniel forward. The stage lights seared his eyes. Rows of journalists stared, pens poised, cameras hungry. Daniel's legs shook. He gripped the edge of the podium as though it might anchor him to the earth. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to run back into the shadows. but Keller's hand rested gently on his shoulder. Every mark tells a story. Even when erased, the board remembers. Daniel raised his eyes. "I am not a ghost," he said, voice trembling but clear. "I am a boy who listened." The room stilled. He spoke haltingly, but each word carried the weight of nights written in silence. "I listened to water in gutters, to bubbles collapsing in sinks, to mop buckets sloshing across tiles. I listened to books thrown away, to chalkboards half erased, to words leaking through doors I was not allowed to open. All my life the world told me I did not belong. But equations do not care about belonging. They only care if you listen." Cameras flashed like lightning. Some reporters wept. Others scribbled furiously. A journalist asked, "Do you understand what this means? Do you know what you've done?" Daniel hesitated. Then, "I only wrote what I saw. If it means something to the world, then it belongs to the world." The revelation shattered boundaries. Stanford offered him a place, not as a janitor's son, but as a scholar. Funding poured in. Governments requested consultations. Companies extended offers. But more than prestige, more than money, Daniel had cracked something deeper. He had cracked the illusion that genius belonged only to the credentialed, the privileged, the anointed. The Ghost of Stanford Lab had become flesh, and in doing so, he proved that brilliance can bloom in the shadows. In the weeks that followed, Daniel stood before classrooms not as an intruder, but as a teacher. Graduate students took notes as he explained fractal cascades with metaphors of playgrounds and mop buckets. Professors argued with him, and he argued back, fearless now that his voice had been heard. Yet at night, he still returned to his notebook. Alone, under lamplight, he wrote not for cameras, not for recognition, but for the silence that had birthed him. One evening, Keller asked him, "Do you regret being discovered?" Daniel looked at the professor, eyes older than his years. "No. Ghosts cannot change the world. People can." The revelation was complete. The boy who once slipped through doors at 2 a.m., terrified of alarms and shadows, now walked openly through Stanford's quads. Students turned to watch, some in awe, some in envy, but all knew they had witnessed something irreversible. He was no longer invisible, no longer a ghost. He was Daniel Alvarez, proof that genius, like turbulence, emerges from where you least expect it, unpredictable, uncontrollable, unstoppable. Some ghosts vanish when morning comes, but Daniel's story reminds us that hidden brilliance, once revealed, can change the world. If this tale moved you, please subscribe. Share it with others and leave a comment. Your voice helps keep stories like this alive.